The CIA officer in this story did not just betray secrets. He betrayed the agency, misled investigators, escaped FBI surveillance with a deception trick that sounded like a training exercise, reached the Soviet Union, and died in Russia without ever facing an American courtroom. That is why Edward Lee Howard remains one of the most unsettling names in Cold War espionage. Aldrich Ames was arrested. Robert Hansen was arrested. Howard was not. If you define got away with it carefully, he is one of the rare traitors for whom the phrase actually fits. Howard joined the CIA in 1981, and what makes the case chilling from the beginning is how close he stood to the center of the machinery. He and his wife, Mary, were both CIA officers. He was trained as a case officer for a posting to Moscow, one of the most sensitive stations in the world during the Cold War. That meant access not just to documents, but to tradecraft, operational methods, Soviet-related intelligence activity, and the kind of contextual knowledge that becomes dangerous, even when it is not written on a single page. He was not an outsider guessing at secrets. He was being prepared to handle them professionally. The first turning point came in 1983, and it did not look like a spy thriller yet. It looked like a personnel problem. Shortly before his planned Moscow assignment, Howard failed a polygraph. Reporting at the time and later archival accounts said the failed polygraph and follow-up review raised concerns about past drug use, petty theft, alcohol abuse, and his overall suitability. The CIA fired him rather than sending him overseas. In one sense, that decision probably prevented even deeper damage. In another sense, it created a furious former insider with training, grievances, and knowledge that did not disappear when the badge did. That detail matters because intelligence services spend enormous effort worrying about penetration from the outside while the most dangerous threat can be a rejected insider from the inside. Howard had been judged unfit for one of the most sensitive jobs in the world, but he still knew enough to do major harm. Later reporting suggested the CIA rethought how it handles officers judged unsuitable precisely because the Howard case showed how abrupt dismissal can create a counterintelligence nightmare. If you train someone for Moscow, let them see the edges of the system, then cut them loose in humiliation, you may have created the very person the enemy wants to meet. After leaving the agency, Howard moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and took civilian work. On paper, that sounds like a routine career collapse. In practice, multiple later accounts describe a life sliding into bitterness and instability. There were reports of heavy drinking, financial strain, behavioral volatility, and escalating resentment. Historical reporting says he made or attempted contact with Soviet representatives after leaving the CIA. Investigators later gathered evidence indicating that he met Soviet intelligence in Europe, including Vienna, in 1984 and again in early 1985, and that he was paid for classified information. One later account described Swiss gold coins, a Rolex, and other signs of sudden money or gifts after those meetings. For an embittered former officer, the grievance had apparently become a business. The next major twist came from the other side of the Iron Curtain. In 1985, a Soviet defector named Vitaly Yurchenko identified Howard as someone working with the KGB. That tip finally gave American investigators a concrete suspect. The FBI confronted Howard in September 1985 and placed him under surveillance. At that point, the story stopped being a quiet betrayal case and became a race. The Americans now believed a trained former CIA officer had sold secrets to Moscow. Howard now knew or strongly suspected that investigators were closing in. The question was no longer whether he had done damage. The question was whether he could be stopped before he disappeared. What happened next is one of the most embarrassing surveillance failures in modern American espionage history. Howard and his wife executed a deception that sounds almost too theatrical to be true. A dummy made from clothes and a wig stand was placed in the car so it looked as though Howard remained in the passenger seat. During the drive back from dinner, Howard slipped out of the moving vehicle in a surveillance blind spot while his wife continued home. She then reportedly played a tape of Howard's voice over the phone, fooling agents who were wiretapping the line into thinking he was inside the house. It was exactly the kind of low-tech, high-creativity tradecraft that intelligence officers respect and investigators hate. The escape exposed how fragile even a serious surveillance operation can be when terrain, staffing, and timing all go wrong. One archival congressional-style account said only one FBI agent was watching the house at the crucial time. Later reporting on the FBI file suggests the technical and visual setup in the desert environment around the home was awkward. Inexperienced personnel were involved, and the surveillance regime was not nearly as robust as the stakes demanded. Remember who the target was: a former CIA officer trained in deception, The margin for error should have been almost zero. Instead, the margin was large enough for him to vanish. From there, Howard moved through domestic and international flights under confusing ticketing arrangements, reached Helsinki, and made his way to the Soviet side. By 1986, Soviet media publicly announced that he had been granted political asylum. That public announcement mattered because it changed the case from a manhunt into a geopolitical humiliation. The United States was no longer trying to catch a fugitive inside its own system. It was looking at a defector now protected by its principal Cold War adversary. Once Howard reached the Soviet Union, the odds of ever putting him in an American courtroom collapsed. What exactly did Howard give away? This is where the case becomes both darker and more complicated. Some details remain disputed because the catastrophic Soviet source losses of the mid-1980s were later found to involve other traitors too, especially Aldrich Ames and eventually Robert Hansen. For a time, Howard seemed to explain almost everything. Then investigators learned the rot ran deeper. That is one reason his story matters so much. Howard was a real mole, but his existence also helped hide other moles by making him look like the single answer to a much larger disaster. Even with that complication, several damage points are well supported. The FBI's own historical page has Howard reportedly revealed to the KGB the identity of a U.S. intelligence source in Moscow who is now presumed dead, and that the Soviets expelled 5 American diplomats based on information he provided. A major newspaper archive said the information attributed to Howard included the identity of a CIA-connected officer in Moscow and a top Soviet scientist working on stealth-related matters. The American officer was expelled, and the scientist was jailed and executed. Those are not abstract harms. Those are lives, operations, and national capabilities destroyed in sequence. Howard has also long been blamed for helping expose Adolf Tolkachev, one of the CIA's most valuable Soviet technical sources, often described as one of the agency's greatest Cold War penetrations of the Soviet system. Tolkachev gave the United States invaluable information on Soviet radar and aviation technologies. If Howard helped the KGB identify or narrow in on him, the damage would be enormous. The tricky part is attribution. Because Ames and later Hansen were also betraying sources, investigators cannot cleanly assign every loss to Howard alone. But that ambiguity does not rescue him. It makes the era even more terrifying. Several traitors were feeding the same enemy while the Americans struggled to understand why sources kept disappearing. This is one of the most painful lessons in the whole case. Howard's betrayal did not just hand Moscow useful information, it distorted the investigation into every other betrayal. One historical account explicitly notes that Howard's case temporarily served as cover for Ames and Hansen because investigators initially attributed many of the losses to Howard. In other words, even when Howard did not personally burn every source, his very existence helped misdirect the search for the men who were also burning them. That kind of damage is hard to measure because it spreads through time. A mole can hurt you once by giving secrets away and again by sending you hunting in the wrong direction. Life in Moscow did not turn Howard into a glamorous free man, but it did turn him into a successful fugitive. One archival report described him as a guest of the state. He had KGB-provided accommodation and, for a time, heavy protection. That phrase, guest of the state, sounds almost gentle until you remember what it means. He was alive, sheltered, and beyond American reach because the Soviet security system considered him valuable enough to protect. The man the FBI had under surveillance in New Mexico was now living under the wing of the very government he had betrayed his own country to serve. Yet protection is not the same thing as peace. By 1991, a congressional record entry reported that his security had been reduced and that he feared being abducted, poisoned, or turned over to U.S. authorities. That fear is psychologically revealing. Howard had escaped justice, but he does not appear to have escaped consequence. He reportedly lived in a state of paranoia about revenge or capture. That does not count as moral balance. It does, however, strip away the fantasy that defection guaranteed safety. Once a traitor has outlived his peak usefulness, the protective cocoon can thin, and every old ally starts to look conditional. One of the most striking features of the case is Mary Howard's role in the escape. She reportedly drove the dummy home, sustained the illusion by phone with a tape of Howard's voice, and later visited or spent time near him abroad, yet she was never prosecuted for helping him flee. That sharpens the sense of injustice around the case because her participation appears to have been central. Without the dummy, the timing deception, and the home front cover, the escape becomes much harder to imagine. Howard did not simply overpower surveillance on his own. He had operational help from someone who knew him intimately and understood what the FBI expected to see. This is also why the case keeps resurfacing in discussions of tradecraft. The escape was not about sophisticated gadgets, it was about exploiting assumptions. Investigators assumed the figure in the car was Howard. Investigators assumed the voice on the phone indicated presence in the house. Investigators assumed a basic surveillance posture was enough because the target was already under pressure. Howard used movement, misdirection, and the natural human tendency to trust continuity. If a house sounds occupied and a car appears occupied, the mind stops looking for the exact second the reality changed. Then there is the institutional humiliation. The CIA had judged him unsuitable, but dangerous knowledge still walked out the door with him. The FBI had identified him through a defector's warning and still let him slip the net. The broader U.S. intelligence community watched sources die, disappear, or get rolled up while trying to determine whether one traitor or several were responsible. Howard's case exposed vulnerabilities in personnel screening, post-dismissal handling, surveillance discipline, and damage attribution. It was not just a betrayal by one man. It was a chain reaction through several systems that all assumed they had more control than they really did. Howard died in Russia in July 2002 at age 50. And even his death retained a sliver of ambiguity. One widely circulated report said he broke his neck in a fall at his dacha outside Moscow. Another Russian intelligence-connected account reportedly disputed that version without offering a cleaner alternative. The safest way to say it is that he died in the Moscow area in circumstances reported as accidental, though not described identically by every account. Even at the end, the story would not sit still inside a simple official line. Why does this case still matter now? Long after the Soviet Union itself disappeared? Because it shows how espionage disasters are rarely about one dramatic exchange in a dark car park. They are about institutions managing imperfect humans under pressure. A failed polygraph in 1983 seems like a bureaucratic footnote until you trace the line forward. A bitter ex-officer in Santa Fe seems like a private tragedy until you connect him to dead sources in Moscow. A dummy in a passenger seat seems almost ridiculous until you realize it let a trained insider escape the United States forever. It also forces a harder question about intelligence culture. What do agencies owe to people they reject after training them? Deeply? Not in a sentimental sense, but in a counterintelligence sense. Howard appears to have been a man already carrying instability, alcohol problems, and other red flags. Once he was removed, the danger did not vanish. It changed shape. That is one reason later reporting suggested the CIA reconsidered how it deals with officers judged unfit for service. You cannot simply terminate access and assume the knowledge becomes harmless. Sometimes the most dangerous phase begins after the firing. There's another reason the case endures. It ruins the comforting idea that traitors always get caught, tried, and locked away. In public memory, espionage cases often resolve with an arrest, a courtroom, a sentence, and a prison cell. Howard's story does not. He sold out his country, appears to have helped expose a source now presumed dead, may have contributed to the destruction of some of the United States' most sensitive Cold War operations, and still died under Russian protection rather than American custody. That is why the phrase "got away with it" remains so powerful here. It is not rhetorical decoration. It is an unnerving factual summary. And yet, the phrase needs one final correction. Howard got away from trial. He got away from prison. He got away geographically. He did not get away clean. His legacy is not that of a master spy living in triumph. It is the legacy of a disgraced insider, a protected defector, and a man associated with paranoia, blood on the ledger, and one of the ugliest chapters in American counterintelligence. If you want the next episode, it has to be the one on how Howard's betrayal accidentally helped hide Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen for longer, because that is where this story becomes even more damaging than one traitor alone. There is a deeper tragedy in the timing too. Howard came into focus during the mid-1980s, exactly when U.S. intelligence was watching Soviet and Warsaw Pact sources get arrested, vanish, or die. Each new loss increased the pressure to find a culprit quickly. That pressure can distort judgment. Once Howard was identified by Vitaly Yurchenko in 1985, he looked like the solution to a terrifying puzzle. A former CIA officer with Moscow training, possible Soviet meetings in Vienna in 1984 and early 1985, signs of sudden gifts like Swiss gold coins and a Rolex, and now a defector pointing a finger at him. The case almost begged investigators to stop there. That is part of why Howard became so damaging. He was guilty enough to satisfy the immediate need for an answer while the full scale of penetration remained hidden. The Tolkachev angle shows why the emotional charge around Howard never faded. Adolf Tolkachev was not just another source. He was one of the most valuable technical penetrations the CIA ever had inside the Soviet system. Intelligence from him reportedly gave the United States extraordinary insight into Soviet radar and aviation capabilities. When a source of that value is lost, the damage is not limited to one operation file. It can ripple into weapons development, military planning, and diplomatic confidence. Even if later traitors complicated the attribution, Howard remained bound to that era of collapse in the American mind because he fit the moment so perfectly. Trained insider, angry dismissal, Soviet contact, dead sources. The Howard escape also reveals how the best deception often looks embarrassingly simple after the fact. A dummy made of clothes and a wig stand is not advanced technology. A taped voice on the phone is not science fiction. What made the trick effective was timing and expectation. The FBI was already watching a real man in a real house. After a real confrontation, surveillance teams often work through patterns, assumptions, and probabilities. Howard and Mary attacked exactly that human layer. By the time anyone realized the pattern had been broken, the window had closed. That is what made the escape so humiliating. It was not beaten by a futuristic gadget. It was beaten by imagination, local weakness, and a blind spot. One archival account saying only one FBI agent was watching the house at the crucial time should still make people wince. A former CIA officer suspected of working for the KGB was one of the last people in America who should have been managed with a light touch perimeter, later reporting that the desert terrain complicated the visual setup and that inexperienced personnel were involved only deepens the sense of institutional failure. Howard did not disappear from an ideal surveillance box. He disappeared from a box that had holes in it. The case is also a warning about how intelligence bureaucracies classify danger. It is easy to obsess over people who still hold active access because they seem to possess the freshest documents. Howard shows why former access can be just as dangerous. A trained case officer carries tradecraft, operational awareness, and human source knowledge that remain useful to an adversary after employment ends. The CIA removed him from one path by canceling the Moscow posting, but the knowledge base he had built did not evaporate with the employment contract. In intelligence work, yesterday's insider can be tomorrow's emergency. That helps explain why Howard's story is more than just a character study in bitterness. It is a system story. The personnel screening system flagged him late. The dismissal process appears to have produced rage rather than containment. The surveillance system failed when time mattered most. The damage assessment process then unfolded inside the fog created by Ames and Hansen. In other words, Howard exposed a vulnerability at almost every stage of the chain, from recruitment and suitability to monitoring and attribution. His years in Moscow add one more twist. Being a guest of the Soviet and later Russian state sounds like a victorious ending if you imagine espionage through films. In real life, it likely meant dependence. The protection, housing, and security were not gifts in the ordinary sense. They were instruments of control. When a 1991 congressional record entry said his security had been reduced and that he feared kidnapping, poisoning, or surrender to U.S. authorities, it suggested a man who understood how conditional his safety had always been. He had escaped American justice by entering another security apparatus, not by becoming free of security apparatuses altogether. That is why the phrase "got away with it" needs to be handled with precision. If it means he escaped American arrest, trial, and prison, then yes, he got away with it. If it means he built a happy second life untouched by fear, that is much harder to defend. The available reporting points more toward a protected but paranoid exile than a triumphant master spy. The Soviet state gave him refuge because he was useful. It did not give him innocence. Still, the final accounting is ugly for the United States. Howard died in Russia in 2002 at age 50. No American judge sentenced him. No American jury heard the full case. No prison term balanced the operational damage. He remains one of those rare intelligence figures whose punishment was mostly historical rather than judicial. His name survives as a warning inside the story of Cold War betrayal because the normal machinery of justice never caught up with him.